It was a cold sound that the soldiers never forgot. Not the scream of shells, not the crack of rifles. It was the strange tearing noise in the air just before everything around them exploded at once. Men who had survived years of war felt their stomachs drop because this was different. This was not a shell hitting the ground. This was death arriving in the sky, perfectly timed, perfectly cruel. And the German soldiers at the Battle of the Bulge had no idea it was coming. Before we go any further, if you enjoy deep war stories told like a long night talk by the fire, take a second to support the channel. Hit subscribe, tap like, share this story with someone who loves history, and leave a comment with your thoughts. It helps more than you know, and it keeps stories like this alive. Now let me take you back to December 1944. Western Europe was frozen solid. Snow covered forests, roads, helmets, and the bodies of men who had fallen days earlier and would not be moved for weeks. The war, which many believed was almost over, suddenly roared back to life. Hitler had thrown everything he had left into one last gamble. The goal was simple and desperate: break through the Allied lines, split their armies in half, capture fuel and supplies, and force a peace deal. That gamble became known as the Battle of the Bulge. For the German soldiers, this was supposed to be a return to the old days. Fast movement, surprise, shock. They marched through the Ardennes forest, the same dark woods they had passed through in 1940 when victory came quickly. Many believed this would be the same. The Americans were new, tired, spread thin, and guarding what was thought to be a quiet sector. At first it worked, S-lines, creating confusion and panic. Units were cut off. Towns changed hands again and again. Snowstorms grounded Allied planes. German tanks rolled forward under white skies, and for a brief moment, hope returned to the German ranks. But the war had changed. What the German High Command did not fully understand was that American industry had not just been building more planes and tanks, it had been building ideas. Quiet ones, small ones, things that didn't look impressive in a parade. One of those ideas was hidden inside artillery shells, anti-aircraft rounds, and even tank ammunition. It was called the proximity fuse. On the outside, it looked like any other shell: metal casing, explosive inside. Nothing special. But inside the nose of that shell was something new and terrifying: a tiny radio device. When the shell flew through the air, it sent out a signal. When that signal bounced back from something solid, like the ground or a human body, the shell exploded. Not when it hit, not when a timer ran out, but when it was close enough to kill. Before this, artillery had to hit the ground near enemy troops to be effective, or explode at a set height that might or might not be right. Against soldiers in foxholes, forests, or moving formations, a lot of shells were wasted. But proximity fuses changed that completely. Now shells exploded in midair, right above the ground, spraying fragments down and outward like a metal storm. Soldiers could not hide. Trees did not protect them. Snow did not soften the blast. And worst of all, the explosion came without warning. The Germans had heard rumors of strange Allied shells earlier in the war, especially during air battles over Germany. Bomber crews had noticed that American anti-aircraft fire seemed too accurate. Fighters were being torn apart even when shells didn't appear to hit them directly. But rumors in wartime are easy to dismiss. By December 1944, Germany had much bigger problems than worrying about a new fuse. Then the skies cleared. Around December 23rd, the weather finally broke. The clouds lifted. The snowstorms faded, and suddenly the full weight of Allied air power returned. American and British planes filled the sky. They hunted German columns, bombed roads, smashed fuel convoys, and turned retreat paths into burning wrecks. But it wasn't just planes that returned. American artillery units, which had been firing almost non-stop since the battle began, now had clear targets and better conditions. That's when the proximity fuses truly revealed themselves. German infantry advancing through open fields were hit by artillery fire that seemed alive. Shells burst above them, not behind, not ahead, but right where they were. Entire squads were cut down in seconds. Veterans who had survived Stalingrad, North Africa, and Normandy were stunned. They had never seen anything like it. Men dove into the snow, pressed themselves against the earth, or hid under trees, only to be killed anyway. The explosions came from above, raining death downward. German officers tried to make sense of it. At first, they believed American gunners had become incredibly skilled overnight. Then they thought it was a new kind of airburst shell, using better timing. But captured equipment and battlefield evidence told a different story. These shells were not timed. They were thinking, in a way. They sensed their targets. One German report described infantry units being almost completely destroyed by artillery fire without direct hits. Another spoke of men being killed while lying flat, something that should have saved them. Tank crews were shocked too. Shells exploded near vehicles, damaging tracks, antennas, and exposed crew without scoring a direct hit. Commanders began spreading warnings, but there was no real defense. The Americans, on the other hand, knew exactly what they had. The proximity fuse had been one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. It was so sensitive that early in the conflict, Allied commanders feared if one shell failed to explode and was captured, the Germans might copy it. For a long time, its use was limited, but by late 1944, with Allied forces pushing into Europe and Germany on the defensive, those restrictions eased. The fuse was now used widely in artillery, especially during the desperate fighting in the Ardennes. American artillery doctrine already emphasized speed and coordination. Forward observers called in fire quickly. Guns adjusted fast. Now, with proximity fuses, the effect multiplied. A single barrage could wipe out formations that would have survived earlier in the war. German attacks stalled not just because of tanks or planes, but because their infantry simply could not move without being torn apart. One American artillery officer later said it felt unfair. Not in a guilty way, but in a quiet, stunned way. He knew that when he gave the order, men on the other side would die, who never saw the shell that killed them. There would be no chance to run, no warning sound, just a burst in the air, and then silence. For the German soldiers, the psychological impact was just as devastating as the physical damage. War already wears men down: cold, hunger, fear, exhaustion. But this added something new. A feeling that the enemy had eyes everywhere. That the sky itself was watching. Men began to hesitate before moving. Attacks slowed. Units bunched up, which only made the artillery more deadly. The Battle of the Bulge was full of dramatic moments. Bastogne surrounded. Tanks dueling in snowy villages. Desperate last stands. But behind all of that was artillery fire shaping the battlefield hour by hour. And proximity fuses were quietly tipping the balance. German commanders tried to adapt. They ordered troops to spread out more, to move under cover, to attack at night. But winter days were short, and supplies were running low. Fuel shortages meant tanks were often abandoned. Roads were choked with wrecks. And every delay gave the Americans time to bring up more guns. By early January 1945, the German offensive had lost its strength. The Bulge was shrinking. American forces counterattacked from north and south, squeezing the trapped German units. Artillery continued to pound retreating columns, and proximity fuses made every open road a killing ground. What had begun as a bold gamble ended as a slow, bloody withdrawal. After the battle, German officers openly admitted how shocked they had been by the effect of American artillery. Some called it the most frightening weapon they faced in the West. Not tanks, not planes. Artillery that could kill without touching the ground. The proximity fuse did not win the Battle of the Bulge by itself. War is never that simple, but it played a quiet, deadly role. It multiplied the power of every gun. It saved Allied lives by ending fights faster. And it showed how technology, when paired with industry and training, could change the nature of battle almost overnight. When the war ended, many soldiers went home and tried to forget the sound of shells bursting in the air. Some never could. Years later, veterans on both sides still spoke about those explosions with a pause in their voice, because that sound meant there was nowhere to hide. And if this story made you stop and think, take a moment now. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, share it with someone who loves history, and tell me in the comments what part of the Battle of the Bulge you'd like to hear about next. When the German retreat truly began, it didn't look like the sharp, fast pullbacks they remembered from earlier years. It looked tired. It looked slow. Columns of men moved through snow that reached their knees, dragging wounded comrades on sleds made from doors and broken crates. Horses collapsed in the cold. Trucks ran out of fuel and were pushed off roads so others could pass. And above all of it hung that fear of the sky. Even when it was quiet, even when no shells were falling, men flinched at every distant boom, every echo rolling through the frozen trees. American artillery never really slept during those weeks. Guns were set up behind ridges, in clearings, along frozen roads. Crews worked with numb fingers, gloves stiff with ice. Shells were stacked in neat rows, their metal skins biting cold to the touch. Somewhere in those shells were proximity fuses, small and almost humble, yet capable of changing everything once fired. The gunners trusted them now. They had seen the results. When observers called in fire on German infantry in the open, the gunners knew what would happen before the shells even landed. German units learned to dread certain sounds. The whistle of incoming shells was bad enough, but the real terror was when there was no warning at all. Just a sharp crack above, followed by screaming, shouting, and then silence. Men who had survived years of frontline fighting felt suddenly helpless. Training, courage, experience, none of it mattered when the explosion came from the air at exactly the wrong moment. One German soldier later said it felt like being hunted by something you couldn't see. Not a man, not a machine, something smarter than chance. That feeling spread fast. Morale cracked in places where bullets and tanks had failed to do it. Units that might have pushed forward hesitated. Orders were followed more slowly. Fear does that. It seeps in quietly and stays. On the American side, soldiers noticed the change too. Infantrymen advancing behind artillery barrages found fewer Germans firing back. Positions that should have been strong were shattered. Foxholes were empty or filled with bodies. Some American soldiers felt relief, others felt uneasy. War had already taken so much, and now it seemed even more one-sided. The proximity fuse wasn't just deadly against infantry. It played a role in stopping German counterattacks as well. When tanks tried to advance with infantry support, artillery fire broke up the infantry first. Tanks without foot soldiers were vulnerable. They couldn't see well in forests or towns. They couldn't protect themselves from close attacks. Once the infantry was gone, tanks became isolated, easier targets for airstrikes or anti-tank guns. German commanders began writing reports that sounded almost defeated, even before the battle was officially lost. Some openly stated that American artillery had reached a level they could not match. Germany's own artillery was short on ammunition, short on trained crews, and often forced to move constantly to avoid air attacks. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to have endless shells, fresh crews, and perfect coordination. Behind that coordination was something else worth understanding. The proximity fuse wasn't just a clever idea. It was the result of scientists, engineers, factory workers, truck drivers, and soldiers all pulling in the same direction. Tiny radio parts had to be built to survive being fired from a gun. They had to work in freezing cold, in rain, in snow. They had to be cheap enough to make by the millions. And then they had to be shipped across an ocean, stored, handled, and used correctly in the chaos of war. That kind of system is hard to build. Germany tried similar ideas, but bombing, shortages, and constant pressure made large-scale production nearly impossible. By late 1944, Germany was fighting with what it had left. America was fighting with what it could still make tomorrow. As January dragged on, the fighting turned into a slow grind. Towns like Houffalize and St. Vith were retaken. The Bulge shrank day by day. German soldiers pulled back to earlier lines, then beyond them. Many realized the truth they had tried to ignore. This was the end, not just of the battle, but of any real hope of turning the war around. When the Battle of the Bulge officially ended, the cost was terrible on both sides. Tens of thousands dead, wounded, or missing. Villages destroyed, forests shattered by shell fire, and woven through all of it was the quiet presence of a small invention that had tipped the scales when it mattered most. After the war, Allied officers studied the battle closely. They talked about weather, leadership, logistics, bravery. But again and again, artillery came up, and within that conversation, proximity fuses stood out. Some called them one of the most important inventions of the war, not because they were dramatic, but because they worked every time, without mercy, without emotion. German veterans remembered them too. In interviews years later, some still shook their heads when they spoke about those shells. They didn't talk about anger. They talked about surprise, shock, a feeling that the rules had changed without warning, that the old instincts no longer kept you alive, and that in many ways is the true story of the Battle of the Bulge. Not just tanks and generals, but moments when technology quietly rewrote what survival meant on the battlefield. Let's pause here for a moment. If you're still with me, take a second to support the channel. Subscribe if you haven't already, hit like, share this story with someone who loves history, and drop a comment. It really helps keep these long, careful stories alive. After the snow melted and the guns finally went quiet, the battlefield itself told the story better than any report ever could. Trees in the Ardennes stood stripped and broken, their branches shredded, as if clawed by something wild. The ground was torn open in thousands of small craters, not deep ones like the old shells made, but shallow scars spread wide. This was the mark of airbursts, the sign that explosions had come from above, not below. Anyone who knew artillery could read that ground like a diary. American troops moving through those forests weeks later sometimes stopped and stared. Even hardened men who had seen Normandy and Hurtgen Forest felt something different here. You could walk for 100 yards and see nothing but torn earth and scattered equipment, rifles bent, helmets cracked, packs ripped open and frozen stiff. Often there were no bodies left to find, just pieces of cloth, frozen dark into the snow. That was the work of proximity fuses. They didn't just kill, they erased. Word spread fast through Allied ranks about how powerful these shells were. Infantrymen felt safer knowing artillery overhead could stop an attack before it reached them. Tank crews felt less alone. Commanders planned with more confidence. The fuse became a quiet promise. If the enemy moved in the open, the guns would take care of it. But there was also a strange respect that came with it. Some American gunners talked about it in low voices, not pride, more like awe. They knew they were holding something that changed the balance of life and death in seconds. One gun crew leader said later that he used to imagine the shell flying, sending out its signal, listening, waiting, then deciding. He knew it wasn't alive, but in war, the line between machine and fate gets blurry. The Germans felt that blur even more sharply. Captured soldiers questioned after the battle often mentioned artillery before anything else. Not tanks, not planes, artillery. Some spoke about being afraid to move even a short distance. Others described watching entire groups vanish in a single burst of fire. One officer admitted that his men had begun to believe the Americans could see them through the ground. That's how little sense it made to them. German attempts to study the shells came too late. A few unexploded rounds were recovered, but by then the war situation was hopeless. Even if they had fully understood the fuse, there was no way to copy it at scale. Factories were gone. Skilled workers were dead or scattered. Power was unreliable. Time had run out. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany in early 1945, proximity fuses followed them. They were used along the Rhine, in the push through the West Wall, and later in battles inside Germany itself. The same pattern repeated. Infantry caught in the open suffered terrible losses. Defensive positions that once held out for days collapsed quickly under airburst fire. By the time the war ended in May, proximity fuses had become a standard part of Allied artillery use. They were no longer a secret. They were simply how things were done. Soldiers who joined late in the war assumed artillery had always been like this. Veterans knew better. They remembered when shells had to hit the ground to matter. They remembered hiding under trees and actually surviving. Those days were gone. After the war, military thinkers sat down to ask hard questions. What does it mean when technology can remove chance from the battlefield? When survival depends less on skill and more on whether you are seen by a sensor you cannot detect? The proximity fuse was one of the first answers to that question, and it made many people uneasy. Some argued it saved lives overall by shortening battles. Others pointed out that it made killing easier and more distant. Both were true. War rarely offers clean answers. For the soldiers who lived through it, theory didn't matter much. What stayed with them were moments, a quiet march through snow, a sudden burst above, friends gone in an instant. Years later, many could still hear that sound in their dreams. Not a roar, not a scream, just a sharp crack in the air, followed by nothing. The Battle of the Bulge is often remembered as Hitler's last gamble, as a story of stubborn defense and heroic stands. And it was all of that. But it was also a moment when a small invention quietly showed what the future of war would look like. Invisible sensors, perfect timing, death from above, without warning. And that future didn't stop in 1945. Proximity fuses became the starting point for smarter weapons, guided weapons, systems that could sense, decide, and act faster than any human. The soldiers in the Ardennes were among the first to face that reality, even if they didn't know it at the time. If you're still listening, I want to pause again. Stories like this take time, care, and a lot of respect for the people who lived them. If you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel, hit like, share this with someone who loves real history, and leave a comment. Your support keeps these long human stories going. As winter loosened its grip and the roads turned from white to brown, the war moved east. But the memory of what happened in the Ardennes moved with the men who survived it. Soldiers talk. They always do. Around campfires, in ruined barns, during long rides in the backs of trucks, they told the same story again and again. How the shells burst above the trees. How whole groups vanished. How you learned to fear clear skies, almost as much as storms. American artillery units became something close to legend among their own troops. Infantrymen trusted them with a kind of faith that only comes from seeing death stopped at a distance. When scouts reported German movement, there was a quiet confidence. Call it in. Wait. It'll be over soon. And most of the time it was. German soldiers, meanwhile, carried the opposite feeling. a sense that the ground itself had turned against them. Retreats became nightmares. You couldn't bunch up. You couldn't rush. You couldn't even pause too long in the open. Every move felt like a gamble, and the house always seemed to win. There's a detail from the last months of the war that often gets overlooked. German units began moving more at night, not just to avoid planes, but to escape artillery observation. Darkness became a shield. That tells you something. When men choose the risk of getting lost, separated, or ambushed over moving in daylight, you know fear has reshaped their thinking. The proximity fuse also changed how battles ended. In earlier years, fights dragged on. Positions had to be cleared step by step. Casualties piled up slowly. Now, a well-timed barrage could collapse resistance in minutes. Commanders saw opportunities to push forward faster, to save their own men by overwhelming the enemy quickly. It didn't make war gentle, but it made it decisive. There's a strange truth in that. Many of the most frightening weapons are praised for saving lives. Not because they are kind, but because they end things sooner. That was the argument made after the war. And it wasn't wrong. But for the men on the receiving end, that logic brought little comfort. As Allied armies crossed the Rhine, proximity fuses were used again and again. German defenses, already thin and exhausted, struggled to respond. Bridges, river crossings, and open approaches became killing zones. Units broke apart before they could even form a proper line. The war in the West was clearly winding down, but it was no less deadly for those caught in its final stretch. Then, almost suddenly, it was over. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, many soldiers felt relief mixed with something harder to name. They were alive, but they carried sounds and images that would not fade. For some, the sharp crack of an airburst became a permanent memory, a reminder of how close death had come and how quickly it could arrive without warning. After the war, proximity fuses didn't disappear. They became standard, improved, refined. Other nations studied them closely. What began as a secret experiment became a normal part of modern warfare. Few people outside the military ever noticed. There were no parades for fuses, no statues, just quiet adoption and quiet acceptance. Historians later ranked wartime inventions by importance: tanks, radar, jet engines, atomic bombs. Somewhere on that list, often overlooked by the public, sat the proximity fuse. Small, simple-looking, deadly beyond belief. A reminder that not all revolutions arrive with noise and spectacle. Veterans, when asked years later what surprised them most about the war, sometimes mentioned it, not by name. Those words say more than any technical report ever could. The Battle of the Bulge is remembered for courage on both sides, for frozen nights and desperate decisions, for men who held lines they were never meant to hold. And woven into that story is this quieter thread, a piece of metal and radio parts that helped decide the outcome when everything else hung in the balance. It's worth pausing on that thought. History often focuses on leaders and battles, but sometimes the true turning points are hidden in small things. Things you can hold in your hand, things that never make speeches, things that simply do their job again and again until the world looks different afterward. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. Truly. Before we continue into the final stretch of this story, take a moment. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Like the video, share it with someone who loves real history, and leave a comment. Your support keeps these stories alive and told with care. When the soldiers finally went home, the war did something strange. It stayed with them, but not in the way movies later showed it. Not as constant noise or hero speeches. It came back in quiet moments, a car backfiring on a city street, fireworks cracking overhead on a summer night, a door slamming too hard. For some men who had fought in the Ardennes, that sharp sound still carried them back to a frozen forest where the air itself could kill you. Many veterans rarely spoke about the Battle of the Bulge in detail, not because they forgot it, but because it was hard to explain. How do you describe fear that comes from above, without warning, without logic you can fight against? You couldn't outshoot it. You couldn't outrun it. You couldn't even see it. All you could do was hope you weren't in the wrong place at the wrong second. Some American soldiers later said the Bulge felt like the last time the war tried to bite back. Germany had thrown everything it had left, and for a moment, it almost worked. That made the victory feel heavier, more serious, less like celebration, and more like survival. Artillerymen especially carried a unique burden. They were often far from the front line, yet deeply aware of what their work did. After the war, a few wrote letters or diary entries where they wondered about the men on the other side of the shells. They didn't doubt the necessity. They just felt the weight of it. When you know your weapon works perfectly, there's no room for illusion. German veterans faced a different struggle. Defeat, hunger, long marches into captivity. And beneath all that, a quiet disbelief at how quickly things had turned. Many had entered the Bulge believing, or at least hoping, that this was a return to something familiar. Blitzkrieg, surprise, momentum. What they found instead was a future they weren't ready for, a battlefield where courage and experience were no longer enough. Years later, military historians would describe the Battle of the Bulge as the moment the old war finally died, the last great offensive powered by hope and desperation, smashed by industry, coordination, and science. The proximity fuse fit perfectly into that story. It didn't care about ideology. It didn't care about bravery. It responded to distance. That was it. As decades passed, the Ardennes healed. Trees grew back. Craters softened. Villages were rebuilt, sometimes right on top of where gun positions once stood. Tourists came. They walked forest paths, took photos, read plaques. It's peaceful there now. Quiet. Beautiful even. But if you know where to look, the land still whispers. A bent tree line. A shallow dip in the earth. A place where nothing quite grows right. Some local families still find fragments after heavy rain. Bits of shell casing, twisted metal, rusted reminders. They pick them up carefully and place them aside, as if showing respect. Because they know. Everyone there knows. The proximity fuse doesn't get a monument. No statue stands in its honor, and maybe that's right. It was never meant to be admired. It was meant to end things quickly, efficiently, without ceremony. Its legacy lives not in stone, but in doctrine, in manuals, in the quiet assumptions of modern warfare. Today's weapons are smarter, faster, more precise, but the idea is the same. Sense the target, decide the moment, act without hesitation. That line can be traced back to those shells bursting over frozen fields in 1944. When we tell stories about the Battle of the Bulge, we often focus on famous moments. Bastogne holding out, Patton turning his army north, brave stands and bold moves. Those stories matter. They deserve to be told. But beneath them is this quieter truth. Sometimes wars are decided not by a single dramatic moment, but by small changes that add up until one side simply cannot continue. For the German army in the Ardennes, proximity fuses were one of those changes. They didn't lose the battle because of one weapon. They lost because everything finally came together against them. Weather broke. Air power returned. Supplies ran out. And the enemy's artillery became something new and unstoppable. For the Americans, it reinforced a belief that would shape the future. That preparation matters, that logistics matter, that science and industry, when guided well, can protect soldiers and shorten suffering. That belief carried forward into the years after the war, for better and for worse. In the end, the Battle of the Bulge wasn't just a fight over territory. It was a clash between past and future, between hope and reality, between what war had been and what it was becoming. And at the center of that change was a small, almost invisible device that turned the air itself into a weapon. If you've stayed with me through this long story, I'm grateful. Truly. These are not easy tales to tell, and they deserve patience and care. If this story moved you, take a moment to subscribe, like the video, share it with someone who loves history, and leave a comment. Your support keeps these voices from fading. As we close, remember this. History isn't just dates and names. It's moments, sounds, feelings, a sharp crack in the sky on a cold morning, and a world changing in the blink of an eye. That's the legacy of the Battle of the Bulge. Quiet, terrible, and unforgettable.